Hello and welcome everyone to this evening's thinking on the future of information. The clocks have gone back, it's already dark, and COVID-19 restrictions probably prevent you from going out anyway, so it's the perfect time to grab a drink, get cozy, and get ready for a discussion about a really, really important topic. I think most of us understand that in today's digital world, we produce a huge quantity of information, far more than we did before we went online. This year, the entire digital universe is expected to reach 44 zettabytes, which means that there'll be 40 times more bytes than there are stars in the observable universe. And every day we add to this deluge. But what fewer people, I think, understand is just how leaky our digital world is. Phenomena such as link rot, which we'll talk about later in this discussion, render billions of megabytes of data unavailable each year. What does this leaky online world mean for democracy, for our ability to hold public officials to account? This evening we'll be asking that, and also about what role private companies such as YouTube or Flickr or Facebook or Google have to play in all this. Many have taken the unilateral decision to remove data from their platforms. It seems that the collection and preservation of knowledge seems increasingly to be at the whim of private corporations. So if we agree that digital preservation is important, what role should public institutions play in preserving it? How far should such institutions work with the big tech companies? And more importantly, perhaps, how should they decide what to keep and what to delete? How should society balance a person's right to have control over their information, including their right to be forgotten, with the wider public need to make sure that that data is preserved for future analysis? To help us answer these questions, we've got three really, really amazing guests. Richard Ovenden is Oxford's Bodley's librarian, which means he's in charge of the university's huge Bodleian library. Alex Krasadaminsky-Jones is the director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. And Carole Cadwalladr is an investigative journalist who, I don't need to tell you, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize last year for exposing malpractice on the part of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Just before we get going, I need to tell you that this is not a panel discussion, despite the brilliance of our guests. This is the think-in, which means that we really, really want to hear from as many of you as possible. And the idea is that the more contributions we get, the better Tortoise's journalism will be on that particular subject going forward. So please don't be shy. Contribute either by posting a message in the chat, which is being moderated by my colleague Phoebe, or raise your blue digital hand and I'll see that you've put it up and I'll come to you. But please get involved. The one rule is no questions. We want to hear from you about what your point of view is, whether you're worried about digital information being lost, who do you think should safeguard it, where do you think the proper story is that we should be looking at. Okay, enough of me. Let's turn to Richard Ovenden. The Bodleian Library collects a huge amount of information each year, and it's amazing that it's one of only a handful of libraries that are entitled to a copy of each publication published in the UK. So I wonder if you could explain how you in Oxford handle the preservation of information, including digital information, and where do you think some of the gaps lie?
Thanks very much. Yeah, so the Bodleian's a big library. We've been collecting information for, this is our 700th anniversary actually as the University Library in Oxford this year. So we've got a bit of a track record of managing to keep knowledge accessible. And one of the things that we have been for 400 years is a legal deposit library. So up until recently, that's meant a free copy of every book published in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, theoretically, lots of gaps in there. But in 2013, the legislation was changed to include digital publications in that list. And that included not just ebooks and e-journals and other kind of formats that are recognizably bookish, if you like, but it also extended to the UK web domain. So since 2014, we've been collecting by law, under the provisions of the law, every website in the UK at least once a year. So that's a whole domain crawl, alongside much deeper web collecting. So we'll choose what we call special collections, where we'll archive websites not just once a year as a snapshot, but we might archive them multiple times a day because they're so dynamic, they change all the time. And we'll archive those selected websites at more lower levels of the web hierarchy, so more comprehensively. So that's relatively unique. There aren't that many jurisdictions where web archiving is mandated by law, and where, in our case, there are 6 institutions which collaborate. So that means we co-fund the activity. We're not really given special funding by the government to do it, but under our various remits, there are 3 national libraries and 3 university libraries that work together to do it. What we're not collecting are, under those provisions, of course, are websites that originate outside of the UK, nor are we collecting social media in any kind of comprehensive manner. And I think that's one of the big questions which I hope that we'll discuss during the course of this thinking. And also what we're not collecting is what I would call the kind of ad tech data. So the user profiling, that is an increasingly major activity in the tech industry, what Carole exposed through the work of her investigations into Cambridge Analytica, the kind of stuff that makes online commerce work, but also which is being, as Carole's shown and other investigations have shown, being used for more troubling activity even than ad tech. However, we are doing some of that web archiving in a much more kind of global collaborative way. There are institutions, libraries and archives all over the world getting much more active in this space. But there are also what I call kind of activist archivists who are becoming much more visible in this space. I mean, just look at there are about 4 or 5 groups that are archiving Donald Trump's Twitter feed, for example. So I think there are huge gaps. I should also declare myself as the president of the Digital Preservation Coalition, which is an international coalition of organizations which have an interest in keeping digital information accessible over the long term.
I suppose if someone was listening to that who worked at a company like Facebook or Google, they'd say, why should I be giving my proprietary ad tech data, which I've taken kind of years to build up, and is a kind of business asset? Why should I be giving it to the Bodleian Library? And equally, someone who had a Facebook post in Texas, why should, like, how would you ever get the consent to collect, for example, the Facebook post of someone who was living in Texas?
Well, I don't think we necessarily would, but an organization in Texas might well work with their local community, as the National Library of New Zealand is doing with New Zealanders, to say, under the license that you clicked through and probably didn't read with Facebook, you have the right to your own user profile. So please donate it to the National Library of New Zealand so that we can build up a record of New Zealand life as expressed in Facebook. And that's something which is a kind of live project the National Library in New Zealand are doing, and is something which I think could serve as a model for other organizations in other parts of the world to follow. In terms of the ad tech data, I think that's it. You know, if we want to understand how the world is working, on how communication is happening, how advertising is being sold, how consumption is working, how all sorts of aspects of human behavior in the 21st century is operating, we need to have ad tech data for study and research. And of course, there are a range of problems with that, not least the kind of legal and societal ones. But I think we need to be looking at it. We need to, there are ways in which it can be anonymized. There are all sorts of ways I think that we could approach it. But I think in order to be able to understand the world we live in now, as the kind of investigations that Carole and others have been doing, we need to have an archive of that data.
Carole, you said in a very famous TED talk that you gave a couple of years ago now, I think, that the 2016 Brexit referendum took place in darkness, and that what happens on Facebook stays on Facebook. And what struck me about that was it seemed that you were saying that there were basically two problems. There was the kind of the viciousness of the anti-immigration adverts that were appearing in a very targeted manner on the platform, but there was also the fact that Facebook was kind of keeping this very, very close to their chest and potentially even deleting the data that would prevent a future journalist or an academic from analyzing it. So can you just speak about that a little bit and about how much of a problem that is?
Sorry, am I unmuted now? So yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I really wanted to hear what Richard had to say on these issues, because it really troubles me still that essentially that this thing of the entire evidence base of what happened in the 2016 referendum is missing. We don't have access to it. A private company has it. A private company has refused to hand it over to Parliament. A private company has refused to even come and answer questions to our legislators about it. And I think it's really interesting putting it in the framework, as Richard has done, of the Bodleian Library, of 700 years worth of British history. That is, we've gone to great efforts as a nation to make sure that we preserve it, and it's there for future generations to study. It's there for academics to study. And, this idea that this absolutely pivotal moment in British history was completely communicated in these ephemeral messages, which were only seen by the people they were targeted at. We got no idea why they were chosen for targeting. And the only thing we do know is that what happened was illegal, in that it subverted British electoral laws. So that's been a finding by various findings by the Electoral Commission. But we've got actually still no idea of the scale, because what happened is this sort of technology, it enabled this subversion of our laws, these laws which have been around for 100 years. Suddenly there was this mechanism by which people, if they wanted to, could break the law. And there was absolutely nothing to stop them, apart from a sort of gentleman's agreement. That's what it turns out our sort of electoral laws rest on. And it still drives me absolutely up the wall that this company has refused to hand it over. And I'm kind of unwilling to let it go. And I've spotted Richard as a co-collaborator on this issue. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here today, to listen to what he has to say on the subject, and really see, is that this should not, I really fundamentally believe that in so many ways is that we cannot let this stand, that actually that belongs to us. And what happens in our elections must be a matter of public record that is accessible to researchers. And this is a fight we've still got to take.
Yeah, and after all, we created that information ourselves. A lot of those, that user profiling is being scraped from various sources for us contributing it free of charge. Why shouldn't society have access to it? And it can be used for actually positive purposes. There are ways, algorithmically, data mining. There's all sorts of ways in which under the proper circumstances, it could be used for society's benefit, but we certainly need to use it to understand how those elections and other aspects of public life are manipulated. And if we live in an open society, the preservation of knowledge, I think, is one of the pillars of that open society.
Can I ask you a quick question, Richard? Is that, am I right in thinking that political pamphlets are gathered and collected by the British Library?
They're gathered by all sorts of institutions. Actually, we have collections. If they're formally published, we'll collect it. We have the archive of the Conservative Party in the Bodleian, so we have all their election manifestos. Every party candidate has publishes leaflets and has done going back to the early 20th century.
Yes.
So we've got an incredible record of all of that. We collect posters. We have the archive of William Henry Fox Talbot, the inventor of photography. He was also an MP. We have all these campaign posters and all of those kind of things. So we know the kind of things that they were saying in a very much more, obviously in the analog world. We need to be able to understand how all of this data was circulating in the most recent times and is still being manipulated today.
And it's like, we're going to look back. I really think, future generations are going to look back on, is this going to be this kind of black hole when this, mad stuff essentially happened in Britain, well, in lots of countries, and we're not going to know how the machinery of it, the mechanisms of it, it's completely lost. And that to me is the sort of scariest aspect of it. It's not really us. It's that, as I say, the kind of the fact that it's there's going to be no resource there for the journalists and academics and researchers of the future.
I just wonder if I could ask all three of you, and maybe if any of the participants have a view on this, then please come into the chat. We spoke when we were just in the green room, the digital green room before we opened it up to everyone, about how the fact that regulation hadn't really caught up and that governments hadn't really caught up with what was happening with data and private companies. And I hear what you both are saying, Carole and Richard, about that there's a public interest in being able to analyze this information. But a political pamphlet that's printed and handed out is a matter of public record. You can easily pick that up and store it. But this information is held by a private company, which technically has the legal right, I suppose, to keep it, and is also often based offshore. So from everyone's perspective, Alex and perhaps I could turn to you first. How do you square this circle when you're sitting in Britain and you're talking about an American company, an American private company? How do you actually move towards a position that you can practically hold them to account?
Well, I think, you talked to this idea that the digital regulation, thanks so much for having me, digital regulation is slow. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think, one is that we are in a sort of quote unquote liberal democracy, and that, managing information, managing speech, these are sort of thorny issues that are much harder for us to make decisions about than, some often white men sitting in a Californian advertising company's boardroom, or indeed for a government official in Moscow or in Beijing or elsewhere around the world. So we do just move slower on these issues in general. And I think, when we talk about the difficulties of dealing with international corporations, as you do, we do forget that there is this enormous international tug of war going on. I think traditionally we'd have thought of America as kind of being on side here, but even America is divided over what we should be doing about these kinds of things. And we are seeing, moves towards different types of regulation being pushed by states on the one hand. On the other hand, you've got, Ajit Pai and the sort of freedom gang sitting in DC who don't want any regulation at all. So I think, we are no closer to a kind of international settlement for how liberal democracies ought to be approaching matters of like this and actually, across the board with digital regulation. I suppose the last thing I'd say there as to why these things are so difficult, and I think, why this conversation is so valuable, is that one of the things that always seems to come up with digital regulation is a focus on content over a focus on process. So a lot of the digital regulation that we have seen so far has been focused on types of content. And if you look at the kind of content moderation practices of major platforms, all their terms and conditions, it's super, super content focused. You can look at the NetzDG law in Germany, even regrettably, the forthcoming online harms regulation being proposed here in the UK. It's a very content focused approach. And actually, I think the question we need to be asking ourselves here is not only what is being preserved and what is being deleted, but how is it being preserved? How is it being deleted? If we are aggrieved that evidence on war crimes ought to be preserved for posterity, well, how do we preserve them in such a way to make them admissible as evidence in a court of law? If people are being abused online on a social media platform, for instance, and that content needs to be removed, or it also needs to be preserved for posterity to allow for cases to be made, and so on. So I think that's another sort of really key point that I would try to underscore, is it's not just a question of what, but also a question of how. Thank you very much for that. I was just reading some comments from people who were contributing. Andrew Girdwood said that Greenpeace have a rule that you should screen grab everything. I completely agree. I remember when I was doing an investigation into YouTube and the press office accused me of lying, and I had a screen grab, and that was quite a satisfying process. Can we move on? We're going to come back to private companies, but let's just talk for a second about link rot. Link rot, bit rot, data rot. I didn't really understand this concept before, but it affects trillions of files being lost on a daily basis. Richard, tell us about link rot.
So, with so much information being published online, that, and particularly searching and accessing that information depends on finding the URLs for that information. And the internet is a massive kind of linked resource. That's the whole point of it. That's how it functions. That's its kind of core architecture. So if the links don't resolve, if you click on a link and it takes you to nothing, it takes you to a 404 or some other kind of block, if it hasn't been formatted correctly, or more importantly, if it hasn't been maintained, then it's going to take you nowhere. And the information may or may not be there. But all of the work that we've done with the legal deposit libraries in archiving the UK web domain shows that the resolvable URLs that we've captured in 2014 become fewer and fewer of them will resolve as you get nearer in time. So over time, the web is a very ephemeral platform. And this becomes a big problem when you rely on the web to deliver information. So the kind of prime case for me is the US Supreme Court, which publishes all its decisions now online. But the Harvard Law Library and Jonathan Zittrain did a famous study in 2014 where they found that 40% of the links took you nowhere. So that kind of fundamental tool for democracy wasn't actually functioning properly. And so that sense that you can't rely on everything being online, the famous kind of mantra, is a pointer to the importance of archiving information, to maintaining the health of online publication systems in the first place, but also archiving information when it does become available, so that it can be referenced, so that those very, very important things that society depends on, laws, public information of that kind, can be a reliable point of reference, that you can cite it in a legal case, that you can know when you're breaking the law or not. These are absolutely fundamental things which we take for granted all the time, because we've been used to them being sat in printed form on the shelves of multiple libraries and institutions available for reference. But when they're published online, they become somehow so much more ephemeral.
Can you give us, if you will, a few concrete examples of how link rot or degradation can lead to real world dangers? I think you've mentioned before link rot in the context of potentially a COVID inquiry or in the context of nuclear decomposition.
Yeah, so one of the organisations that we work with at the Digital Preservation Coalition is the UK Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So they have an interest in keeping digital information accessible over the long term because nuclear waste is something that's going to be around for a long time, and for thousands of years, and our successors in thousands of years' time will probably find it quite useful to know what nuclear waste has been buried, where, in what container was it put in, what substance was it originally when it was created, exactly when was it put wherever it was put, all of that kind of information. And, if we're having trouble maintaining digital information that was created just a few years ago, think of the problems down the line that society will face. So it's an absolutely kind of critical issue that and bodies like the Digital Preservation Coalition are grappling with it, but we need to take it much more seriously as society in general.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in, if I may, Andrew Girdwood, who's been making some really great points in the chat about Libya and about link rot in the context of Libya domain shorteners. Andrew, are you around?
Yes.
Do you mind just explaining? Do you mind just putting the same point to the floor?
Sure. So on link rot, I have a bugbear about link shorteners because they
just explain what they are. Just explain. So
a link shortener is a web. So for a poster or social media, you take a very long, ungainly URL and you put it through a third-party service who prevents, ideally, a beautified URL, but at the very least, a much shorter URL, so it can fit on your poster, or it will take up less of your characters in your social media share quota. So they're quite popular. They're very useful, and link shorteners from people like Twitter even sanity check the websites that you're about to go to and give you a warning, will intercept you if they think there's a virus or untrustworthy information. So it sounds good in principle, but my problem with them is that they channel so many of the internet's links through these points of failure. What if Bitly loses its funding? It has a flaky business model at the best of times. And in the early days, .ly domains were very popular. So your Bitly link could be even shorter because it'd be bit.ly/tortoise. But .ly is the Libyan top-level domain. And they had many years ago such civil crisis that they couldn't maintain their domain name, their infrastructure broke. And so every .ly URL out there ever was broken until they got it back online. So that's like a granddaddy of link rot across the internet.
Thank you so much. I really had no idea about that. Just before we turn to back to the guests, Sally, I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm so sorry, Cholewa, has said very interesting about the difficulty in preserving original records. Sally, are you around?
Yes, hello.
What you've said that from a legal standpoint, to collect a digital original record is quite difficult. Can you explain what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so when obviously you are creating a digital document, especially, so my background is sort of in the third sector, private business area, it is really quite difficult to actually pin down what the final version of said record was. And if you are kind of, trying to actually take a point from before it was the final version, that earlier version may not exist anymore. And then just because, unless you've got all the right sort of situations in place in terms of security and access, what is your audit process there to show that that record hasn't then actually been changed or tampered with at any point either in the future? So actually really being able to pin down that sort of final absolute digital version is much harder in a sort of digital world than a paper one.
Thank you, thanks. And let's turn back to Richard and move on to the role of private companies in this whole debate. So we've seen the two examples that I picked out were Flickr, which a couple of years ago suddenly deleted a huge number of its users' photos. So unilaterally wiped out a huge amount of memory that had been collected, and YouTube, which caused a lot of controversy by removing videos of potential Syrian war crimes. So potentially, Richard first, and then Carole, what does this say about the power of private companies to control our knowledge?
I think it says everything, really. I mean, you know, these services are ostensibly free, and they're incredibly convenient to use. And how many of us have, you know, logged onto them, clicked through the license without actually reading it, and discovered that, you know, our level of control can be quite minimal. And so the example of, you know, the Flickr example, the YouTube example that you've just used, there are a legion of them. There was one just recently, a company called Ever, whose strapline was making memories, who was, you know, so they provided a kind of digital preservation service, or so they describe it. It's really just an online storage service. They deleted all their customers' content on the 31st of August. So, you know, not a very good example for, you know, an online digital preservation service. But really what we are doing is outsourcing our memory to these tech companies as society, without kind of realizing it. And it's not just those kind of formal storage systems like Flickr, but it's also, you know, if you have, you know, used Gmail or Hotmail, or if you have images in your Facebook account, or in other, you know, in Dropbox, we're you know, you suddenly find individuals, and, you know, scale that up across society with their memory, their own record spread across multiple different platforms. And we're beginning to find individuals who die, and their loved ones then want to get at their correspondence, or the images that they have, or other forms of content. And we're beginning to find problems with kind of digital wills, you know, give you an example. Barbara Castle, this is before the social media days, left us in her will her archive. So we ended up with hundreds of boxes of paper plus 2 PCs. Now, unfortunately, she didn't leave us with the passwords for the PC, so we had to hack into them. Now, that was fine, but you know, somebody doing that today with multiple different social media accounts, or things like Dropbox and other sharing services like that, if they haven't left that information, it's going to cause an absolute kind of nightmare. And, you know, with individuals who, like Barbara Castle, that, you know, we might actually be very, very interested over long periods of time to be able to, you know, understand who she was communicating with, what her thoughts were, how the process of formulating policy ideas that ended up as laws, all of these kinds of things are yeah, actually really valuable for a society to have its own memory.
Thank you. Carole, when you're talking about what we should preserve, because Richard has highlighted a really, really serious problem that I don't think many people fully understand, which is that digital information is actually very unstable and gets lost all the time. And the obvious kind of corollary to that is we should take more steps to preserve it. But the big question, I suppose, is what should we preserve? So going back to Facebook, your specialist topic, look at QAnon accounts, for instance. So you could make the argument that, you know, these things are important to understand the growth of a conspiracy theory across a whole country. We should preserve them. There should be a method of preserving them so that we can look back in 50 years' time or 100 years' time and work out how it works. But lots of people have been calling for Facebook to delete these accounts, and I think that they in fact have. So for you, where is the line between preservation and deletion?
So that's a really interesting question. And like, so one example I think of that is the accounts which we discovered, the Twitter and Facebook accounts we discovered were being run by the Kremlin, by the Internet Research Agency. And we only discovered this when I think it was the Senate Intelligence Committee published the account names and things. And at that moment, you could look them up and you could discover all these places where they'd been quoted in, very reputable, even The Guardian had got some of them embedded into news stories and things. So you were able to see them. At that point, they took them down. Actually, I think it still took them a little time to take them down, but we knew where they were before they were taken. So they could be studied. But I think one of the things which happens now is that, Facebook will announce we've taken down 40,000 accounts in authentic, coordinated network, whatever they call it. And those are gone. So those are 40,000 accounts which were trying to influence, the last place I think was Azerbaijan, having this massive influence operation in an election there. And it's been taken down. And so great that they've dealt with it, but bad that we've got no idea what impact that had. It can't be studied. And, that's again, it comes back to the story I'm talking about around Brexit. And there's one example which infuriated me at the time, which was, I don't know if any of you remember, but Dominic Cummings used to be on Twitter. He was Odyssean Project. And for the first kind of couple of years that I was trying to investigate this stuff, he was not a well-known public figure, but he was on Twitter and he would get into spats and rages and also give answers and things about stuff. Plus we also had his archive going back. We could see what he was sort of saying at different points. And that was incredibly useful. And also, particularly from the journalistic point of view, is that we needed that information. There was this one thing that he kept on talking about. I had a letter, the Electoral Commission said I had permission. And then suddenly overnight, he deleted his account. He vanished off Twitter. And there was a couple of people who really, I think it was this guy called John Worth. He immediately started looking in all the caches to try and piece together what we could find. And so it was this sort of rapid response from various sort of journalists and archivists to find the digital traces and to put them together. And he rescued a few of them, but most of it had gone. And that, I still regret that to the day. And I assume the other person who just vanished like that and is incredibly pivotal to what's happened, certainly what happened in the US election is Julian Assange vanished from Twitter. All of his tweets have gone. I assume that somebody has archived that, but actually I don't know who. But anyway, to go to it is that we now actually, so in this, I've been involved in setting up this sort of non-profit journalism organisation called The Citizens. And one of the things we've had a volunteer do is come along and archive key Twitter accounts that interest us to make sure that if that happens again, that we've got them. But it's quite a lot of effort and resource that goes into doing that. And as I say, we're just doing it on the ones which are most obvious to us, which we don't want to disappear. And yeah.
Carole, do you think anyone should have the right to delete their Twitter account?
Well, I mean, yes, because I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, yes, in that it's you. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel you should put that one to the crowd. It's a kind of philosophical question. But I certainly feel in terms of public figures who've played absolutely key and pivotal roles in our recent political history, then we should have access as researchers, as journalists, as historians, as archivists to that information. And Twitter has it. Twitter has that. In fact, there was another one. Sorry, can I just bore on for just a little bit briefly? There was another account. I don't know if anybody remembers this. David Joe Brexit 57594 or whatever. He came up. There was somebody did a research, and he was one of the top 10 accounts that had been influential during the 2017 general election, I think. And then there was this suggestion that it wasn't actually that, he wasn't who he seemed, and was he a troll, and was he Russian, and whatever. And then that account just deleted like that. And so we didn't have access to that. And I remember going through, you know, the Twitter press office and blah, blah, blah. You know, we needed to find, we wanted to have, and again, they just refused point blank. So it is, it's a huge issue, and it's a huge issue just in terms of, you know, accountability, I would say. You can't have accountability if you don't have a record of people's behaviour and actions, can you?
So let's turn to Alex, because we haven't heard him for a little bit. Alex, where do you think the line is between what we should preserve and what we should teach?
Well, it's really difficult for a number of reasons. It's funny. I was also going to tell the David Jones anecdote, because that was actually a Demos piece of research that sort of, you know, it was really funny because this guy just kept cropping up in all of the different research papers that we were writing. We did some stuff around, you know, some terror attacks in the UK, on Brexit, on the general election. All the time we would hear from this David Jones Brexit guy, and we were sort of big fans of his in the Demos office. Turns out that, you know, he wasn't all he claimed to be, and yeah, of course, everything he got deleted. And that is a problem that, you know, as researchers who try to work with social media data and have done for about 7 years now, and it's astonishing how much the landscape of, you know, what we as nerds would describe as sort of API access, or, you know, or barriers to data collection, how they've sort of sprung up over the last 7 years. You know, our ability to sort of interpret and analyze and archive, of course, these spaces has got worse over the last 7 years rather than got better, and it's always driven by scandal one way or another.
I think, sorry to cut you off. I'm just conscious that we've got 15 minutes, and I'm gonna be killed if I don't allow Phoebe to show her really brilliant slides that she's prepared on that. She's got 5 slides. We're going to go through them quite quickly, but they really do show the scale of some of the things we're talking about. So can I turn to Phoebe to take us through the slides?
Yeah, so just wait for them to be put up. Yeah, so our first slide here is the growth of the data sphere. So this is the global data sphere, which is a measure of all the new data captured, created. It's measured by the International Data Corporation. And they kind of reckon that by 2025, there's going to be about 175 zettabytes of data. I've put there the equivalent in a Netflix library being downloaded. That's the entire Netflix library. You can also compare it to the Great Wall of China. If each gigabyte in a zettabyte were a brick, there'd be 258 Great Walls of China. It's quite hard to imagine. It's just good to see how much data is already out there. And you can see that line at 33 zettabytes, that's about 2018. So it's this huge growth of data that we're trying to control here and trying to archive. And then the next slide. So where is all this data? We had this conversation, it's kind of good to know. So about 38% of the world's hyperscale data centers are in the United States. Hyperscale data centers are centers with more than 5,000 servers. Most of them, unsurprisingly, are owned by Amazon. They kind of had the big lead in the industry. One of their big customers is Netflix. So it's likely that when you stream, it's going through one of their centers. And then Microsoft and Google are hot on the heels. And 9% of them are in China and 6% are in Japan. And some of these are huge, vast buildings that they use for these centers. And there's more being built. There's another 174 already on the way to being built. And the next slide. So this is what we were talking about data decaying. So this is a study done by Harvard Law School. It was in 2013. And they found that 70% of the links in a sample of law journals, including their own at Harvard Law School, and 50% of the links in US Supreme Court no longer work, which clearly is a huge thing, especially for law, when you're able to go back over previous documents. So they kind of set up this perma.cc. You might have seen articles linked in that way. They link up with libraries, specifically law, but also other libraries, including, I think, the University of Oxford. So Richard can correct me on that one. But it's one of those suggestions and ways that you can prevent data rot. So these links are permanently looked after. But clearly this is a small project and it doesn't encompass the whole of the internet. And the next slide. So on deleting history, Alexi kind of hinted at it, but Syria is a really interesting example. There's a group called the Syrian Archive. They're a Berlin nonprofit, and they work specifically on archiving YouTube videos and other social media content documenting the Syrian war. Of the 1.7 million YouTube videos preserved by them, 16% had already been removed and no longer accessible. This is because around 2017, a lot of algorithms started being used in those moderation ways that they moderate in YouTube. And that meant that a lot of content was deleted because of the violence being shown, but that necessarily was also used as evidence of war crimes. And also there's a really fascinating report, which I can link to, by Human Rights Watch, called Social Media Platforms Remove Evidence of War Crimes, video unavailable, in September of this year. And they also look into this and the way that it really makes it hard for investigators and researchers to hold perpetrators to account when that content is automatically deleted as it comes into YouTube and other platforms. And then finally, we're kind of going to talk about solutions. I'm sure that Alexi will bring it up. So Chris Hughes, one of the co-founders of Facebook, proposed 3 solutions in a Guardian article in 2018. We've talked about some of them. One of them is regulation. So transparency about where that data is being held, how they're looking after it. Is Cambridge Analytica still holding onto that data? Where has Facebook got that data? 2 is data agents. These are people that would collectively negotiate on users' behalf with groups like Facebook, with groups like Google, with Amazon. And finally, data tax or memory tax. So taxing the revenues of companies that collect and store data and using that revenue to then support digital archiving, because this all costs a lot of money. This is not an easy project to look forward to with that much data being out there. Yeah, and that's all these slides for you.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. That was great. So whilst those slides were being shown, there were some really interesting comments that were being made. Tom Schuller highlights that potentially, I mean, it's a kind of obvious point, but we haven't addressed it. There's real environmental impacts of collecting so much data. That's a point echoed by Sally, who we heard from earlier. So can we go though to one of the people who were saying that they do think that we should have a right to delete Twitter profiles. Professor Lucy Hugman, are you around? Lucy, are you around?
But there were loads of people saying yes to that, not just me.
Okay, well, you were the person with the most impressive title, so I came to you. Why do you think that you did? First of all, let's just.
I'm a researcher too, so obviously I'm in the same position as many people. Of course, you want them kept for research. But social media, I mean, ever since the beginning, it's been a nightmare to research for social science researchers, for other people. I'm not one of those people, but basically, for a start, everyone wanted to research these massive data sets. It was like the new oil of data, and tons of researchers wanted to pile in, and there was lots of money around to research it, but you couldn't do proper scientific research because none of the companies will let you share the data sets with other researchers. So it was quite compromised from the beginning, and the conferences were often sponsored by the companies themselves, and everyone got into a terrible mess. But I think for political reporting and journalism, obviously it's been absolutely fantastic. But of course, everyone like Dominic Cummings would twig that it's not in his interests to leave this trail. So in a way, I can't speak for Carole, but I imagine what she's had to do is what, journalists have always had to do, is dig away at all sources, find the wrongdoing and the illegal behavior and call it out. And this has been a marvelous sort of few years of having this stuff. But I'm not sure there's any compelling reason for the private companies to let us keep what they call their data, which is why Sir Tim Berners-Lee and other people who are now trying to work on projects to enable people to keep their own data securely are very, very valuable, but they're not here yet. They're not here yet. So I don't think we can do anything to stop individuals deleting their own Twitter accounts. But I do think in terms of proper, research, whether it's university research or journalistic research, you have to do action research. It's terribly time consuming and it needs lots of people. You have to follow them as you go along and just screen grab, and that becomes impossible. So when you discover new things, like you might discover in the Senate review, and you want to backtrack and double check because you're a good journalist, it's going to be difficult.
Thank you. Richard, can I come back to you on this? So let's say for a minute that you have the permissions of these private big tech companies to systematically collect all the data that they produce, and you've got enough funding and enough collaboration to be able to do that. So you're not only collecting everyone's posts on Facebook, but you're collecting all the likes and the nudges and all the other reactions. So in that scenario, Richard, what do you not preserve, and how do you make sure that people's rights over their information are maintained? And how do you make sure that, notwithstanding the respectability of the Bodleian, that its access isn't abused itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all key issues to which there are, I don't have kind of specific, I don't have an entire framework for archiving this material in place now, but there are approaches that can be used. I mean, I think it is a big problem that these data sets are so huge. I mean, the Library of Congress had an arrangement with Twitter for 10 years where they started to archive. In fact, they still have that original archive, which, but they had to give it up because the resource required to manage it was getting so big that they just couldn't afford to do it, which is why part of the reason why I've been suggested the idea of the memory tax.
Just tell us about the memory tax.
Sorry?
Tell us about the memory tax.
So what I think is that because archiving digital information is, I think, an absolute necessity for society to deal with, that the platforms and the organizations which are driving so much of our online behavior and who are making such vast fortunes out of our interactions, that the labor that we are providing free of charge for them, that they should give us some of that resource, some of those profits back in order to deal with the social challenge of digital preservation. But I think, archives have developed other approaches in over time, which could be used. Sampling is one of them. With huge data sets, you can sample in order to provide some understanding of what is going on. You can close records. You can keep them, the National Archives, the archives world more generally have quite established closure regulations, which mean that certain classes of records are kept, are unavailable until the closure period is ended. You're all used to the National Archives. Now it's 20 years. It used to be a 30-year rule, making classes of records open and available. So I think that sort of mindset that there will be an accounting with history, particularly for the behavior of public, state officials or publicly funded officials, that, their activities are going to be move into the public domain over time. I think that is a kind of a check and balance on the behavior of public officials, that if they move their own communications into the private sphere, they're going to try to evade that regime.
Carole, we were talking before about where WhatsApp and potentially private groups on Facebook fit into all this. Is there not a danger that if there is a move towards accountability on the public platforms, that people are, especially state government officials, are just going to move on to these peer-to-peer networks where even the operators of the networks can't read what is being posted on there? And what do you think is the implications for accountability for those networks, and what would you do about it?
Well, I think so in terms of I mean, that's where the law's got to come in, because we actually have freedom of information laws. There's a civil service code, there's a ministerial code. These private messaging apps shouldn't be being used. If they should be being used, they should be being preserved. So I do think we have to enforce the laws that we have, and that's extremely important. Coming back to Dominic Cummings, this is somebody who, I mean, the other thing you've got to look at is intent. So Dominic Cummings was, he was actually found guilty by the ICO more than a decade ago for using a private email account to evade FOI legislation. So I think in that sense, that's on us. You can't blame the platforms for. But I think, was there a second part to your question, Alexi?
No, I think that was it. That was it.
Okay, fine, that's it. That'll do.
Just before we wrap up, I just want to come to Chris Chadwick, who we were talking about solutions, and I think that he's got a great one. It might be Tim Berners-Lee's solution, but I'd like to hear what Chris thinks about it. Chris, are you around?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So talk to us about locking data into pods.
Yeah, well, I mean, just first of all, I think this is a fascinating conversation that has been running for a long time. And part of the problem with this is, who does that data belong to? It's a really fundamental question around, if I post something on a public domain site, do I still own the words that I wrote? And there is, I think there's a legal issue around that. And it's very difficult to pin that down, especially when the tools that I used potentially to post it basically told me that I had to give them everything when I sent it in the first place. And so Tim Berners-Lee's kind of, he's been grappling with this issue. This is the guy who invented the internet in the first place. And he's been realizing that, what was originally created to help people share information has now become, in the control of a few people who are actually gaining all that data, and they can mine it like nobody else. They can learn from it faster than anybody else. And they are continuing to hone their systems to get everybody to give them more data faster, quicker. And it's a self-serving kind of. Now, I do believe that, the ability, then the power of the internet for people to share and to interconnect is massive. And there are many people who are willing to do that, who want to do it. But I guess Tim Berners-Lee is trying to find a way of, giving me, or the user, the author, the ability to say, look, I'm prepared to put this into the public domain. If you want access to it, you can have the rights and I'll give them to you, but the rights are protected by me. And I link the people that I want to link. And, effectively, it's almost like an ulterior identity. So you put your information into a pod, and the pod has, kind of sections within it. So I might have a finance section in my pod and a personal data section in my pod. And I give, banks access to certain things. I give other people access to certain things in that pod. But the pod is protected and held by me. And I give, so instead of giving my identity, I just give you access the same way that, banks do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is absolutely fascinating. And Lucy in the chat says that we should invite Tim Berners-Lee on here. And I think that is a great idea. We've come to the end, I'm afraid, of this discussion. I am going to do the usual editor thing of just spending a couple of minutes wrapping up. I think the most interesting fact that we've learned in the last hour is that Oxford University tried to hack into Barbara Castle's computer. But apart from that, we've had a really good discussion about digital information. What have we learned? It's not collected systematically. It's prone to degradation. There is way too much power to decide what is preserved and what is deleted in the hands of private companies with their own commercial imperatives, exactly as Chris just said at the end. But the ethical questions that arise from trying to work out how to fix the problem are almost as tricky as the problem itself. I really liked Alex's comment about how regulation has been focused historically on content rather than process, and maybe that is something that can switch around. And we do need to look carefully at this whole issue, because exactly as Carole said, and exactly as all her reporting has revealed, this has created immense democratic and social consequences. And we still have no idea of the scale of what happened in 2016. Richard spoke obviously very persuasively about link rot, which I didn't really know much about. I certainly didn't know that the Libyan domain ly had just collapsed with the rest of the country. We might look into what Tom mentioned about the environmental impacts of storing data, which I think is a really interesting avenue to go down. But also we should look at the solutions. Do we want a memory tax? Do we solve this problem by having a closed archive system? Do we need legal changes to ensure that the platforms are properly monitored? Or do we, as Chris said, channeling Tim Berners-Lee, put data into pods? Who does our data belong to, and who has the right to delete it? Such interesting questions. We don't have more than an hour to discuss them, but thank you so much to our guests for coming on. And thank you to all of you for some seriously interesting comments. We can't say goodbye altogether, but we can wave at each other and wish each other a happy evening. So have a great time and speak to you soon.